I'm going to talk to you today about hopefully converting fear into hope. When we go to the physician today, when we go to the doctor's office and we walk in, there are words that we just don't want to hear. There are words that we're truly afraid of. Diabetes, cancer, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, heart failure, lung failure, things that we know are debilitating diseases for which there's relatively little that can be done. And what I want to lay up for you today is a different way of thinking about how to treat debilitating disease, why it's important, why without it perhaps our healthcare system will melt down, if you think it already hasn't, and where we are clinically today and where we might go tomorrow and what some of the hurdles are. And we're going to do all of that in 18 minutes, I promise. I want to start with this slide because this slide sort of tells the story the way Science magazine thinks of it. This was an issue from 2002 that they published with a lot of different articles on the bionic human. It was basically a regenerative medicine issue. Regenerative medicine is an extraordinarily simple concept that everybody can understand. It's simply accelerating the pace at which the body heals itself to a clinically relevant time scale. So we know how to do this in many of the ways that are up there. We know that if we have a damaged hip, you can put an artificial hip in. And this is the idea that Science magazine used on their front cover. This is the complete antithesis of regenerative medicine. This is not regenerative medicine. Regenerative medicine is what Business Week put up when they did a story about regenerative medicine not too long ago. The idea is that instead of figuring out how to ameliorate symptoms with devices and drugs and the like, and I'll come back to that theme a few times, instead of doing that, we will regenerate lost function of the body by regenerating the function of organs and damaged tissues, so that at the end of the treatment, you are the same as you were at the beginning of the treatment. Very few good ideas, if you agree that this is a good idea, very few good ideas are truly novel. And this is just the same. If you look back in history, Charles Lindbergh, who was better known for flying airplanes, was actually one of the first people, along with Alexis Carrel, one of the Nobel laureates from Rockefeller, to begin to think about, could you culture organs? And they published this book in 1937, where they actually began to think about what could you do in bioreactors to grow whole organs. We've come a long way since then. I'm going to share with you some of the exciting work that's going on. But before doing that, what I'd like to do is share my depression about the healthcare system and the need for this with you. Many of the talks yesterday talked about improving the quality of life and reducing poverty and essentially increasing life expectancy all around the globe. One of the challenges is that the richer we are, the longer we live. And the longer we live, the more expensive it is to take care of our diseases as we get older. This is simply the wealth of a country versus the percent of population over the age of 65. And you can basically see that the richer a country is, the older the people are within it. Why is this important? And why is this a particularly dramatic challenge right now? If the average age of your population is 30, then the average kind of disease that you have to treat is maybe a broken ankle every now and again, maybe a little bit of asthma. If the average age in your country is 45 to 55, now the average person is looking at diabetes, early onset diabetes, heart failure, coronary artery disease, things that are inherently more difficult to treat and much more expensive to treat. Just have a look at the demographics in the US here. This is from the Untied States of America. In 1930, there were 41 workers per retiree. 41 people who were basically outside of being really sick, paying for the one retiree who was experiencing debilitating disease. In 2010, 2 workers per retiree in the US. And this is matched in every industrialized, wealthy country in the world. How can you actually afford to treat patients when the reality of getting old looks like this? This is age versus cost of health care. And you can see that right around age 45, 40 to 45, there's a sudden spike in the cost of healthcare. It's actually quite interesting. If you do the right studies, you can look at how much you as an individual spend on your own healthcare plotted over your lifetime, and about 7 years before you're about to die, there's a spike. And you can actually We won't get into that. There are very few things that you can really do that will change the way that you can treat these kinds of diseases and experience what I would call healthy aging. I'd suggest there are 4 things, and none of these things include an insurance system or a legal system. All those things do is change who pays. They don't actually change what the actual cost of the treatment is. One thing you can do is not treat. You can ration healthcare. We won't talk about that anymore. It's too depressing. You can prevent. Obviously, a lot of money should be put into prevention. But perhaps most interesting to me anyway, and most important, is the idea of diagnosing a disease much earlier on in the progression and then treating the disease to cure the disease instead of treating a symptom. Think of in terms of diabetes, for instance. Today with diabetes, what do? We diagnose the disease eventually once it becomes symptomatic, and then we treat the symptom for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And we do okay. Insulin's a pretty good therapy, but eventually it stops working, and diabetes leads to a predictable onset of debilitating disease. Why couldn't we just inject the pancreas with something to regenerate the pancreas early on in the disease, perhaps even before it was symptomatic? And it might be a little bit expensive at the time that we did it, but if it worked, we would truly be able to do something different. This video, I think, gets across the concept that I'm talking about quite dramatically. This is a newt regrowing its limb. If a newt can do this kind of thing, why can't we? I'll actually show you some more important features about limb regeneration in a moment. But what we're talking about in regenerative medicine is doing this in every organ system of the body, for tissues, and for organs themselves. So today's reality is that if we get sick, the message is we will treat your symptoms and you need to adjust to a new way of life. I would pose to you that tomorrow, and when tomorrow is, we could debate, but it's within the foreseeable future, we will talk about regenerative rehabilitation. There's a limb prosthetic up here, similar actually to the one that the soldier that's come back from Iraq. There are 370 soldiers that have come back from Iraq that have lost limbs. Imagine if instead of facing that, they could actually face the regeneration of that limb. It's a wild concept. I'll show you where we are at the moment in working towards that concept. But it's applicable, again, to every organ system. How can we do that? The way to do that is to develop a conversation with the body. We need to learn to speak the body's language and to switch on processes that we knew how to do when we were a fetus. A mammalian fetus, if it loses a limb during the first trimester of pregnancy, will regrow that limb. So our DNA has the capacity to do these kinds of wound healing mechanisms. It's a natural process, but it is lost as we age. In a child, before the age of about 6 months, if they lose their fingertip in an accident, they'll regrow their fingertip. By the time they're 5, they won't be able to do that anymore. So to engage in that conversation with the body, we need to speak the body's language. And there are certain tools in our toolbox that allow us to do this today. I'm going to give you an example of 3 of these tools through which to converse with the body. The first is cellular therapies. Clearly, we heal ourselves in a natural process using cells to do most of the work. Therefore, if we can find the right cells and implant them in the body, they may do the healing. Secondly, we can use materials. We heard yesterday about the importance of new materials. If we can invent materials, design materials, or extract materials from a natural environment, then we might be able to have those materials induce the body to heal itself. And finally, we may be able to use smart devices that will offload the work of the body and allow it to heal. I'm going to show you an example of each of these. I'm going to start with materials. Steve Badalak is at the University of Pittsburgh, about a decade ago, had a remarkable idea. And that idea was that the small intestine of a pig, if you threw away all the cells and if you did that in a way that allowed it to remain biologically active, may contain all of the necessary factors and signals that would signal the body to heal itself. And he asked a very important question. He asked the question, if I take that material, which is a natural material that usually induces healing in the small intestine, and I place it somewhere else on a person's body, would it give a tissue-specific response, or would it make small intestine if I tried to make a new ear? I wouldn't be telling you the story if it wasn't compelling. The picture I'm about to show you is a compelling picture. However, for those of you that are even the slightest bit squeamish, even though you may not like to admit it in front of your friends, the lights are down. This is a good time to look at your feet, check your BlackBerry, do anything other than look at the screen. What I'm about to show you is a diabetic ulcer. And although it's good to laugh before we look at this is the reality of diabetes. I think a lot of times we hear about diabetics, diabetic ulcers. We just don't connect the ulcer with the eventual treatment, which is amputation if you can't heal it. So I'm going to put the slide up now. It won't be up for long. This is a diabetic ulcer. It's tragic. The treatment for this is amputation. This is an older lady. She has cancer of the liver as well as diabetes and has decided to die with what's left of her body intact. And this lady decided after a year of attempted treatment of that ulcer that she would try this new therapy that Steve invented. That's what her wound looked like 11 weeks later. That material contained only natural signals. And that material induced the body to switch back on a healing response that it didn't have before. There's going to be a couple more distressing slides for those of you. I'll let you know when you can look again. This is a horse. The horse is not in pain. If the horse was in pain, I wouldn't show you the slide. The horse just has another nostril that's developed because of a riding accident. Just a few weeks after treatment, in this case, taking that material, turning it into a gel, and packing that area, and then repeating the treatment a few times, and the horse heals up. And if you took an ultrasound of that area, it would look great. Here's a dolphin where the fin's been reattached. There are now 400,000 patients around the world who have used that material to heal their wounds. Could you regenerate a limb? DARPA just gave Steve $15 million to lead an 8-institution project to begin the process of asking that question, and I'll show you the $15 million picture. This is a 78-year-old man who's lost the end of his fingertip. Remember that I mentioned before the children who lose their fingertips. After treatment, that's what it looks like. This is happening today. This is clinically relevant today. There are materials which do this. Here are the heart patches. Could you go a little further? Could you say, instead of using material, can I take some cells along with the material and remove a damaged piece of tissue, put a biodegradable material on there? You can see here a little bit of heart muscle beating in a dish. This was done by Teru Akanu at Tokyo Women's Hospital. He can actually grow beating tissue in a dish. He chills the dish, it changes its properties, and he peels it right out of the dish. It's the coolest stuff. Now I'm going to show you cell-based regeneration. And what I'm going to show you here is stem cells being removed from the hip of a patient. Again, if you're squeamish, you don't want to watch, but this one's kind of cool. So this is a bypass operation, just like what Al Gore had, with a difference. In this case, at the end of the bypass operation, you're going to see the stem cells from the patient that were removed at the beginning of the procedure being injected directly into the heart of the patient. And I'm standing up here because at one point I'm going to show you just how early this technology is. Here go the stem cells right into the beating heart of the patient. If you look really carefully, it's going to be right around this point. You'll actually see a backflush. You see the cells coming back out. We need all sorts of new technology, new devices to get the cells to the right place at the right time. Just a little bit of data, a tiny bit of data. This was a randomized trial at this time. This was an N of 20. Now there's an N of about 100. Basically, if you take an extremely sick patient, you give them a bypass, they get a little bit better. If you give them stem cells as well as their bypass, for these particular patients, they became asymptomatic. These are now 2 years out. The coolest thing would be is if you could diagnose the disease early and prevent the onset of the disease to a bad state. This is the same procedure, but now done minimally invasively with only 3 holes in the body, where they're taking the heart and simply injecting stem cells through a laparoscopic procedure. There go the cells. We don't have time to go into all of those details. But basically, that works too. You can take patients who are less sick and bring them back to an almost asymptomatic state through that kind of therapy. Here's another example of stem cell therapy that isn't quite clinical yet, but I think very soon will be. This is the work of Casey Mara from Pittsburgh, along with a number of colleagues around the world. They've decided that liposuction fluid, which in the United States we have a lot of liposuction fluid, it's a great source of stem cells. Stem cells are packed in that liposuction fluid. So you could go in, you could get your tummy tuck, out comes the liposuction fluid, and in this case, the stem cells are isolated and turned into neurons, all done in the lab. And I think fairly soon you will see patients being treated with their own fat-derived or adipose-derived stem cells. I talked before about the use of devices to dramatically change the way we treat disease. Here's just one example before I close up. This is equally tragic. We have a very abiding and heartbreaking partnership with our colleagues at the Institute for Surgical Research in the US Army, who have to treat the now 11,000 kids that have come back from Iraq. Many of those patients are very severely burned, and if there's anything that's been learned about burn, it's that we don't know how to treat it. Everything that is done to treat burn, basically we do a sodding approach. We make something over here, and then we transplant it onto the site of the wound, and we try and get the two to take. In this case here, a new wearable bioreactor has been designed. It should be tested clinically later this year at ISR by Jörg Gerlach in Pittsburgh. And that bioreactor will lay down in the wound bed. The gun that you see there sprays cells. That's going to spray cells over that area. The reactor will serve to fertilize the environment, deliver other things as well at the same time. And therefore, we will seed that lawn as opposed to try the sodding approach. It's a completely different way of doing it. So my 18 minutes is up, so let me finish up with some good news and maybe a little bit of bad news. The good news is that this is happening today. It's very powerful work. Clearly, the images kind of get that across. It's incredibly difficult because it's highly interdisciplinary. Almost every field of science, engineering, and clinical practice is involved in trying to get this to happen. A number of governments and a number of regions have recognized that this is a new way to treat disease. The Japanese government were perhaps the first when they decided to invest first $3 billion, later another $2 billion in this field. It's no coincidence. Japan is the oldest country on earth in terms of its average age. They need this to work or their health system dies. So they're putting a lot of strategic investment focused in this area. The European Union, same thing. China, the same thing. China just launched a National Tissue Engineering Center. The first year budget was $250 million US. In the United States, we've had a somewhat different approach. Oh, for Al Gore to come and be in the real world as president. We've had a different approach, and the approach has basically been to just sort of fund things as they come along, but there's been no strategic investment to bring all of the necessary things to bear and focus them in a careful way. And I'm going to finish up with a quote, maybe a little cheap shot at the director of the NIH, who's a very charming man. Myself and Jay Vacanti from Harvard went to visit with him and a number of his directors of his institutes just a few months ago to try and convince him that it was time to take just a little piece of that $27.5 billion that he's going to get next year and focus it in a strategic way to make sure we can accelerate the pace at which these things get to patients. And at the end of a very testy meeting, what the NIH director said is, your vision is larger than our appetite. I'd like to close by saying that no one's going to change our vision, but together we can change his appetite. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Richard Rosenthal, and I want to talk to you about something new that doctors are able to offer their patients. It's called regenerative medicine. Regenerative medicine uses your body's own natural substances to generate healing of the injury rather than just covering it up with a pharmaceutical agent.
Back in about 2001, I had a snowboarding accident. tore my ACL, MCL, and meniscus. Kind of limited me on a lot of stuff I could do.
I do CrossFit. I hurt myself once. It was just an injury. I did a lot of mountaineering. No more hiking, no more. I couldn't walk downhill. The pain just kept getting worse and worse.
Regenerative medicine uses the body's own natural healing ability to heal tissues that previously had difficulty healing. We use primarily platelet-rich plasma or stem cells.
A friend of mine told me, hey, you should really check out this stem cell. So I was a little nervous, didn't know what it was to harvest stem cells or bone marrow.
Stem cells are harvested from the patient's bone, and that's what's injected into the patient.
Really no side effects from it, not a lot of pain during the process.
The technique has been very refined, so I don't notice it at all.
Platelet-rich plasma is made by drawing blood and spinning it in a centrifuge in order to concentrate platelets. Now, platelets contain growth factor proteins which generate new blood vessel growth into the area, which supports the growing cells by bringing nutrients and oxygen.
I'm feeling seriously excellent. I'm doing squats, I'm doing deadlift. I mean, this is stuff that I dropped.
I'm really looking forward to being able to get back out on the court and playing a lot more basketball and more mountain biking, those kinds of things that I love to do now.
There's no reason right now to suffer the consequences of wearing out before you die. It's unbelievable, really. It's unbelievable.
Hi, this is Dr. Isaacs. I'm getting ready to do platelet-rich plasma, also called PRP of the face. I have just drawn blood, and now I'm putting the blood in this concentration device, and then I will put this in a centrifuge to get the pure PRP. This centrifuge is special and has the ability to concentrate the platelets 8 to 10 times. Hi, this is Dr. Isaacs again. We just finished spinning the PRP, and this is what it looks like. We're going to remove the top plasma, and the bottom part over here you can see are the platelets. These are pure platelets, 8 to 10 times the concentration. This is what a pure platelet-rich plasma or PRP looks like, and this is the product that we are going to inject into the face. Hollows of the eyes to lay down some collagen and give it nutrition to the skin and cause collagen formation. This is done very superficially and will help with the regeneration of the skin. We're filling up the hollow over here underneath the eye over here with the PRP that I'm going to inject. This is done very superficially, so you just want to lay the PRP there and let it hydrate the skin and provide nutrition and collagen to that area. This is a Cosmo pen that has tiny little needles on the top, and these needles will make tiny little holes like 1 millimeter deep or so, depending upon the area of the skin. And what that does is allows us to put the platelet-rich plasma in there to help produce collagen and tighten the skin. So we are using the Cosmo Pan, and what this is doing is we are getting some punctate bleeding, and with that, this is opening up the pores, and we will be injecting these with the platelet-rich plasma, or PRP. Injected into the pores, and if you notice how it's getting absorbed into the skin, and that's what you want, is for this pure product to be absorbed so it can help strengthen the skin and form collagen and help with smoothing out the finer wrinkles on the face. If you notice this PRP, how it's getting absorbed into the pores, it's amazing, and that's what really helps. Hi, this is Dr. Isaacs. We have just completed the PRP microneedling of the face. If you notice, her face is red, and that implies that there is microneedling punctate bleeding, which is what you want. So to create these micro channels, and through that we rub the PRP into the skin, which got absorbed. And what this will do is produce collagen, recruit fibroblasts, and strengthen the skin. So the PRP is providing nutrition to the skin and making the skin more stronger and healthy. PRP also generates blood vessels into that area. So by increasing the blood supply to the skin, you are going to make the skin look younger and stronger. So afterwards, patients need to avoid the sun for a few days, wear sunscreen and moisturizing cream. Every day you will notice a difference as the skin gets younger and more beautiful. It will probably, this redness may last about 7 days. Every day is going to be a little bit better. And after a few weeks, you will see quite the difference. Some people believe that the PRP microneedling of the face is equivalent to fractional laser. That's how well it works. But the results are phenomenal. I appreciate you watching this video. Please call our clinic if you have any questions. Our number is 505-503-6990. Thank you for your time.
As humans, it's in our nature to want to improve our health and minimize our suffering. Whatever life throws at us, whether it's cancer, diabetes, heart disease, or even broken bones, we want to try and get better. Now, I'm head of a biomaterials lab, and I'm really fascinated by the way that humans have used materials in really creative ways in the body over time. Take, for example, this beautiful blue nacre shell. This was actually used by the Mayans as an artificial tooth replacement. We're not quite sure why they did it. It's hard, it's durable, but it also had other very nice properties. In fact, when they put it into the jawbone, it could integrate into the jaw. And we know now with very sophisticated imaging technologies that part of that integration comes from the fact that this material is designed in a very specific way, has a beautiful chemistry, has a beautiful architecture. And I think in many ways we can sort of think of this use of the blue nacre shell and the Mayans as the first real application of the Bluetooth technology. But If we move on and think throughout history how people have used different materials in the body, very often it's been physicians that have been quite creative. They've taken things off the shelf. One of my favorite examples is that of Sir Harold Ridley, who was a famous ophthalmologist, or at least became a famous ophthalmologist. And during World War II, what he would see would be pilots coming back from their missions, and he noticed that within their eyes they had shards of small bits of material lodged within the eye. But the very interesting thing about it was that material actually wasn't causing any inflammatory response. So he looked into this, and he figured out that actually that material was little shards of plastic that were coming from the canopy of the Spitfires. And this led him to propose that material as a new material for intraocular lenses. It's called PMMA, and it's now used in millions of people every year and helps in preventing cataracts. And that example, I think, is a really nice one because it helps to remind us that in the early days, people often chose materials because they were bioinert. Their very purpose was to perform a mechanical function. You'd put them in the body, and you wouldn't get an adverse response. And what I want to show you is that in regenerative medicine, we've really shifted away from that idea of taking a bioinert material. We're actually actively looking for materials that will be bioactive, that will interact with the body, and that furthermore, we can put in the body, they'll have their function, and then they'll dissolve away over time. If we look at this schematic, this is showing you what we think of as a typical tissue engineering approach. We have cells there, typically from the patient. We can put those onto a material, and we can make that material very complex if we want to. And we can then grow that up in the lab, or we can put it straight back into the patient. And this is an approach that's used all over the world, including in our lab. But one of the things that's really important when we're thinking about stem cells is that obviously stem cells can be many different things, and they want to be many different things. And so we want to make sure that the environment we put them into has enough information so that they can become the right sort of specialist tissue. And if we think about the different types of tissues that people are looking at regenerating all over the world, in all the different labs in the world, there's pretty much every tissue you can think of. And actually, the structure of those tissues is quite different. And it's going to really depend on whether your patient has any underlying disease, other conditions, in terms of how you're going to regenerate your tissue. And you're going to need to think about the materials you're going to use really carefully, their biochemistry, their mechanics, and many other properties as well. Our tissues all have very different abilities to regenerate. And here we see poor Prometheus, who made a rather tricky career choice and was punished by the Greek gods. He was tied to a rock, and an eagle would come every day to eat his liver. But of course, his liver would regenerate every day. And so day after day, he was punished for eternity by the gods. And liver will regenerate in this very nice way, but actually if we think of other tissues like cartilage, for example, even the simplest nick, and you're going to find it really difficult to regenerate your cartilage. So it's going to be very different from tissue to tissue. Now, bone is somewhere in between, and this is one of the tissues that we work on a lot in our lab. And bone's actually quite good at repairing. It has to be. We've probably all had fractures at some point or other. And one of the ways that you can think about repairing your fracture is this procedure here called an iliac crest harvest. And what the surgeon might do is take some bone from your iliac crest, which is just here, and then transplant that somewhere else in the body. And it actually works really well because it's your own bone and it's well vascularized, which means it's got a really good blood supply. But the problem is there's only so much you can take. And also, when you do that operation, your patients might actually have significant pain at that defect site even 2 years after the operation. So what we were thinking is there's a tremendous need for bone repair, of course, but this iliac crest type approach really has a lot of limitations to it. And could we perhaps recreate the generation of bone within the body on demand and then be able to transplant it without these very, very painful after effects that you would have with the iliac crest harvest? And so this is what we did, and the way we did it was by coming back to this typical tissue engineering approach, but actually thinking about it rather differently. And we simplified it a lot. So we got rid of a lot of these steps. We got rid of the need to harvest cells from the patient. We got rid of the need to put in really fancy chemistries. And we got rid of the need to culture these scaffolds in the lab. And what we really focused on was our material system and making it quite simple. But because we used it in a really clever way, we were able to generate enormous amounts of bone using this approach. So we were using the body as really the catalyst to help us to make lots of new bone. And it's an approach that we called the in vivo bioreactor, and we were able to make enormous amounts of bone using this approach. And I'll talk you through this. So what we do is, in humans, we will have a layer of stem cells on the outside of our long bones. That layer is called the periosteum. And that layer is actually normally very, very tightly bound to the underlying bone. And it's got stem cells in it. Those stem cells are really important in the embryo when it develops. And they also sort of wake up if you have a fracture to help you with repairing the bone. So we take that periosteum layer and we developed a way to inject underneath it a liquid that then within 30 seconds would turn into quite a rigid gel and can actually lift the periosteum away from the bone. So it creates, in essence, an artificial cavity that is right next to both the bone, but also this really rich layer of stem cells. And we go in through a pinhole incision so that no other cells from the body can get in. And what happens is that that artificial in vivo bioreactor cavity can then lead to the proliferation of these stem cells, and they can form lots of new tissue. And then over time, you can harvest that tissue and use it elsewhere in the body. This is a histology slide of what we see when we do that. And essentially what we see is very large amounts of bone. So in this picture, you can see the middle of the leg, so the bone marrow. Then you can see the original bone, and you can see where that original bone finishes. And then just to the left of that is the new bone that's grown within that bioreactor cavity. And you can actually make it even larger. And that demarcation that you can see between the original bone and the new bone acts as a very slight point of weakness. So actually now the surgeon can come along, can harvest away that new bone, and the periosteum can grow back. And so you're left with the leg in the same sort of state as if you hadn't operated on it in the first place. So it's very, very low in terms of after pain compared to an iliac crest harvest. And you can grow different amounts of bone depending on how much gel you put in there. So it really is on-demand sort of procedure. Now, at the time that we did this, this received a lot of attention in the press because it was a really nice way of generating new bone. And we got many, many contacts from different people that were interested in using this. And I'm just going to tell you, sometimes those contacts are very strange, slightly unexpected. And the very most interesting, let me put it that way, contact that I had was actually from a team of American footballers that all wanted to have double thickness skulls made on their head. And so you do get these kind of contacts. And of course, being British and also growing up in France, I tend to be very blunt. And so I had to explain to them very nicely that in their particular case, there probably wasn't that much in there to protect in the first place. So this was our approach. And it was simple materials, but we thought about it carefully. And actually know that those cells in the body, in the embryos they develop, can form different kind of tissue, cartilage. And so we developed a gel that was slightly different in nature, a slightly different chemistry, put it in there, and we were able to get 100% cartilage instead. And this approach works really well, I think, for pre-planned procedures, but it's something you do have to pre-plan. So for other kinds of operations, there's definitely a need for other scaffold-based approaches. And when you think about designing those other scaffolds, actually you need a really multidisciplinary team. And so our team has chemists, it has cell biologists, surgeons, physicists even, and those people all come together and we think really hard about designing the materials. But we want to make them have enough information that we can get the cells to do what we want, but not be so complex as to make it difficult to get to clinic. And so one of the things we think about a lot is really trying to understand the structure of the tissues in the body. And so if we think of bone, obviously my own favorite tissue, we zoom in, we can see, even if you don't know anything about bone structure, it's beautifully organized, really beautifully organized, with lots of blood vessels in there. And if we zoom in again, we see that the cells are actually surrounded by a 3D matrix of nanoscale fibers, and they give a lot of information to the cells. And if we zoom in again, actually, in the case of bone, the matrix around the cells is beautifully organized at the nanoscale, and it's a hybrid material that's part organic, part inorganic. And that's led to a whole field, really, that has looked at developing materials that have this hybrid kind of structure. And so I'm showing here just two examples where we've made some materials that have that sort of structure, and you can really tailor it. You can see here a very squidgy one, and now a material that's also this hybrid sort of material, but actually has remarkable toughness, and it's no longer brittle. And an inorganic material would normally be really brittle, and you wouldn't be able to have that sort of strength and toughness in it. One other thing I want to quickly mention is that many of the scaffolds we make are porous, and they have to be, because you want blood vessels to grow in there. But the pores are actually oftentimes much bigger than the cells, and so even though it's 3D, the cell might see it more as a slightly curved surface, and that's a little bit unnatural. And so one of the things you can think about doing is actually making scaffold with slightly different dimensions that might be able to surround your cells in 3D and give them a little bit more information. And there's a lot of work going on in both of these areas. Now, finally, I just want to talk a little bit about applying this sort of thing to cardiovascular disease, because this is a really big clinical problem. And one of the things that we know is that, unfortunately, if you have a heart attack, then that tissue can start to die, and your outcome may not be very good over time. And it would be really great, actually, if we could stop that dead tissue either from dying or help it to regenerate. And there's lots and lots of stem cell trials going on worldwide, and they use many different types of cells. But one common theme that seems to be coming out is that actually very often those cells will die once you've implanted them. And you can either put them into the heart or into the blood system, but either way, we don't seem to be able to get quite the right number of cells getting to the location we want them to, and being able to deliver the sort of beautiful cell regeneration that we would like to have to get good clinical outcomes. And so some of the things that we're thinking of, and many other people in the field are thinking of, are actually developing materials for that. But there's a difference here. We still need chemistry, we still need mechanics, we still need really interesting topography, and we still need really interesting ways to surround the cells. But now the cells also would probably quite like a material that's going to be able to be conductive, because the cells themselves will respond very well and will actually conduct signals between themselves. You can see them now beating synchronously on these materials. And that's a very, very exciting development that's going on. So just to wrap up, I'd like to actually say that being able to work in this sort of field, all of us that work in this field, that's not only super exciting science, but also has the potential to impact on patients, however big or small they are, is really a great privilege. And so for that, I'd like to thank all of you as well. Thank you.